I'm nervous about reliving the pain. I'm nervous about maybe this will trigger a memory that I had suppressed. But I feel it's important for the world to know my story. This is a picture of Reina and Nacho on my mom's porch in front of the house. It's one of my favorite pictures. Her smile and the way he's like leaning into her. Honestly, when I look at this photo, I wish I could go back to this time. I lost 2 kids on July 14th, 2017. The murderer is my son, Ignacio, and the victim is my daughter, Reina. She went to heaven and he went to prison. It's a pain that honestly, I don't wish on anybody. This is the day he got arrested for murder. I get the chills. It's giving me chills right now. Those dark eyes. Those soulless eyes. That smile's gone. That life is gone. That spark is gone. At that point, I hated him. At that point, I wanted him to suffer. Being the parent of a murderer it's not easy. It can be lonely as well, because people just don't understand. Anytime your child is sentenced to prison, it's not only your child. That's the way I see it. It's not only your child, it's you too. You're sentenced as well. I'm sure that there was something that I didn't do. I'm sure that there was something more I could have done. Something. If you ask me if I'm a good or bad mom, I will tell you I'm a bad mom. So it's very frustrating because when your baby's born, you say, I'm gonna give you the world. And when you don't, and when you can't, you feel like a failure. How was I not able to help him? If I knew he was going through all this, why didn't I protect Reina better? It's a pain that is beyond anything. Because your child has taken your other child's life. This is a picture of Ignacio. And that was his typical smile all the time. This kid smiled at a drop of a dime, I swear. These are the little chipmunk cheeks. When Ignacio was born, as soon as I saw his little face, I just fell in love with him. And I thought he was the most perfect little baby in the whole world. And I did think to myself, I'm gonna give you everything you want. You are not gonna know the word no. He had the chunkiest little face, and when he would smile, his little cheeks would just pop up, and he was my little chipmunk. I still say I have 3 kids. And I still say that she's 15. When they ask me, if they ask me their ages, she's 15. And Rodrigo's 23 and Nacho's 26. Both Ignacio and Rodrigo love their baby sister, Marina. They would take care of her, but more Ignacio. And when she would cry, he would run, "Mama, little Sugars is crying." He'd call her Little Sugars, but it was supposed to be Little Sugar. But it was his Little Sugars, and she was crying, and she wanted a bottle, or Little Sugars was getting into something. But he was very protective of her. And I miss those days. I do miss those days. Our family was always together. Those were some of the best years of my life with me, my husband, my kids. If I could bottle up those years and just relive them, I would. Because you still see him as your little boy. You still see him as that little boy who opened up to you, who used to stick up for you, who his mom was everything to him. Maybe wishful thinking, hoping that he wasn't capable of that. When my mom passed away is when I first noticed something different in his behavior. At the memorial, we're all devastated, we're all broken, we're all crying. And he is just sitting, just stoic, no emotion on his face. Not one tear rolled down his eye. Didn't talk. I remember he was wearing a black hoodie, and he had the hoodie on, and he just sat there. I did find that unusual that he didn't show any emotion, not only because my other 2 kids were completely devastated, but because of the bond that he and my mom had. My mom was a huge part in helping raise him. And she was a constant in Nacho's life. And when she passed away and there was no emotion in him, I did find that unbelievable. I couldn't understand why. It was concerning to me to see him like that. And he showed me nothing. Nothing. That was the beginning of something way, way more. That was the moment where he changed. I get home and Ignacio's already handcuffed and in one of the squad cars. And Regal is in the house. The house is a mess, destroyed. Broken windows, broken TV. There was a hole in the wall. I found out that Regal had came home and he saw that the house was like destroyed. And he asked Nacho, in not such a nice way, what he had done. And Nacho replied in not a very nice way, and they started getting into a physical fight. That afternoon was pretty bad.
So did you ever find out why he destroyed everything?
I never found out what made him do that. I have no idea what made him do that. I noticed that his sleeping habits had flipped. He was sleeping during the day and was up all night. I would tell him that it was time to go to bed. I want you to go in your room. And he would. But as soon as I was gone, he was creeping up again at night, getting up. And then if I happened to get up to go check on him, he'd run back in his room. But you could hear him in the living room or the kitchen, so I knew he was awake again. And then we weren't sleeping. We'd be sleeping with one eye open and one eye closed. It was weird to all of us because we had never seen him like that. Sometimes I was even scared to ask him, "What are you doing?" I do look back on that moment and I wish that I would have. But it wasn't him anymore. You could tell in his face, you could tell in his eyes that it wasn't him anymore. It wasn't the Ignacio, the Nacho that I knew. Ignacio loved baseball. Baseball was life for Ignacio. Baseball was everything. When Ignacio was about 7 or 8 years old, his little team didn't have a coach, so I stepped up and I started coaching. And this is one of the fields where we used to practice. Reina thought Ignacio was the best baseball player in the world. If she wasn't as loud as me, she was louder. She loved it, and she made sure everybody knew that Nacho was her brother. Ignacio was chosen to play varsity in high school as a freshman, and of course, we were very proud of him. I would have liked to have seen him at least in the minors. I honestly did. He was that good. I was so proud of him. They're happy, but sad memories at the same time. Ignacio had made up his mind that he wasn't going to go to school. When I found out, I tried talking, my husband tried talking, but you can only talk so much. I could not have a conversation with him anymore. It got to the point where he would just shrug his shoulders. How do I force him to go to school? I don't know. I didn't know. So he didn't have my blessing, but I didn't do anything to stop it. I wasn't okay with it. I wasn't happy with it. And he said it didn't matter to him. I feel like it's just a wasted life, a waste talent. That is one of the hardest things. That's one of the things that hurts me. Because I knew how smart he was. And again, I feel like I'm partly responsible for that. For him not getting there. One afternoon, Ignacio and I had got into an argument. He wanted me to give him money, and I refused. Well, he threw a little fit, threw a tantrum. He had like a 32-ounce, 40-ounce sports drink bottle in his hand, and it was full. And mind you, he used to play baseball and used to pitch. He grabbed that bottle and flung it right at me. And he hit me hard. It hit me hard. I had a big red welt on the side. And I felt very sad. And I told Raina, I said, call the police. I'm not taking this from him. Call the police. She was afraid of him. I knew she was afraid of him. She was. She had told me. And she didn't like to be alone in the house with him. So he got arrested and released the next day. And he came home. There was no apology. And no charges were not pressed. Dad wanted to have him in jail and kept there and stayed there. Whereas me, Mom, the heart of a mother, protect your kid, and no, he's my baby. I feel like a failure because I feel like he should know better. And I feel like it was my job to make sure he knew and not to take that route. That's your job as a parent. And I didn't do something right with him. At times I wanted to shake him and yell at him and tell that person to give me my son back. There was one time where it was in the morning and I was on my way to work and I was gonna leave, and he was up. He hadn't slept, and I was gonna leave, and I told him that I was leaving to please, let's make this a good day. And he looked at me. He looked at me like he hated me. And he said to me, I hope you get in a car accident. I hope a diesel hits you and you get in a car accident. And I had to go to work. It hurts because you know, as a mom, you know who he was, how he was so lovable, the little chipmunk with the little cheeks and the big smile. And his mom was everything, and then to wish something like that or tell you something like that. And I cried all the way to work. And I cried and I asked God why. And I asked God to help me because I knew that wasn't my son. So this little thing here is it's this little throw blanket that I made. I made it myself. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know what I was gonna do. But I had all her shirts. And I knew I couldn't get rid of them or give them away. So I decided to make a blanket. But when I have it, I feel like she's with me. I feel like I'm hugging her. I mean, it's not as good as her, obviously, but for sure, it's being close to me. Give me comfort. And I still have one shirt that I've never washed because I want her smell on it still. Sometimes I'll get that smell and I'm afraid that the smell's gonna go away one day. This picture here is Nacho. I think he might have been a freshman here. And he was still good. He's wearing a rosary on his neck. He was raised Catholic. We didn't go to church faithfully, but we did go. He was baptized. That gets me thinking. I talked about how he had told me he had sold his soul to the devil. But in this picture, he's wearing a rosary. One night, I had come out of my room, and as I got to the end of the hallway, I saw him standing in front of the snowy TV, the snowy screen on the TV. And he's standing there with his arms crossed, looking at the snow, at no picture. And I kind of just stopped and looked over at him. At that time, I don't think it was drugs. He was completely gone. Like, his mental health was gone. At that point, I thought, okay, my son is possessed. Maybe that is some kind of evil, I don't know. Those are the thoughts that were going through my head. I was even scared to ask him, what are you doing? He just kind of looked at me. He told me that he had sold his soul to the devil. I was speechless. It was scary. It was scary because I don't believe you should be playing with that stuff. I believe that once you even have an idea of that stuff, that you're asking for evil to come into your life. I do believe you embrace the darkness and you invite it to come into your life. And that's when bad things happen. And who knows, maybe, I don't know, maybe now that I say it, I think about that. Maybe that's when evil came into our life. And it's just hitting me now that we're talking about it, that maybe that was something that had to do with why he did what he did.
Really? Just now?
Just now. Just kind of exploring, answering your questions. It's starting to hit me that, because he said that he sold his soul to the devil. He opened that realm, that window, and that was the evil that came in. I'm right now I kind of want to scream. I feel this weight on me, and I kind of want to just get up and scream. It's what I'm feeling right now. It's just kind of hitting me like maybe that's what happened. I hadn't put two and two together until now, right now, this moment. And and my chest hurts. And I kind of want to pull out my hair. And I want to punch something. And I want to scream. And I'm trying real hard to just breathe.
Take a break.
Yeah. So, pretty much like all the other times he got arrested, which I think was 3 times maybe, he was always released the next day. And I picked him up once. And that was the time where I told him that he couldn't come home because we couldn't take it anymore. And I told him to get out of my car. I was going to leave him at the homeless shelter. And I told him to get out of my car. And he looked at me. But he was smiling. But he looked at me like, "Are you serious?" And I told him, "Get out of my car." And he got out of my car, and he walked around towards the back, and I'm looking in my rearview mirror, and my heart is breaking. I just couldn't leave him there, just not knowing what would happen to him. I couldn't live with myself, even after all that. And I rolled down my window and I told him to get back in my car, damn it. Because I couldn't leave him there. So we got back in the car and I took him home. Kicking my son out of the house was never an option. Is because he is my son. And my mom would have never done that with us. My mom didn't teach us to be that way. And I don't believe in that either. And he's my son. I cannot go to bed at night not knowing where my son is or what he's going through. Has he eaten? Is he okay? Is he alive? Is he hurt? So that was not an option for me. The whole time, the kids were like so uncomfortable. They were not happy that he was there. Shortly after that, Reina had a dream that Ignacio had killed me, and she told me about it. And I didn't shrug it off, but I assured her that it would never happen. She was convinced that he was going to do something to me. And because it was me and it wasn't her, I didn't feel an urgency to do anything about it. I feel guilty that I didn't listen to her. Pictures of my baby girl. My Reina. She looks a lot like me. We went to Hawaii to celebrate her 15th birthday. In this picture, she's sitting on a boat. We're getting ready to go out to the ocean to go swim with the turtles. Oh my gosh, it was so much fun. I mean, it was something that we did once and something to experience. I'm glad we did it. She wanted to go back, definitely wanted to go back, and I did too. Thankfully, I didn't make that promise to her.
It's something you never expect to hear. Ignacio Estrada charged with killing his only sister last Friday, shooting her inside the Phoenix home they shared. Police found her body inside her bedroom and her brother with the gun still in his hands.
The day I left work, I'm driving. I feel like something's wrong. I pull up to front of my house. I jump out of the car and I hear moaning. I go into the living room, and right where you walk into my living room, I look down and I see my husband and Ignacio on the floor. And my husband is still in his work clothes and he's drenched in sweat. And he's like on Ignacio. And I drop my purse. I'm like, what is going on? My husband says, he tried to kill me. And I go, what do you mean he tried to kill you? With what? And he goes, a gun. And I said, a gun? Where's the gun? And he's like, it's under us. I call 911. The 911 operator tells me she has police on the way. And still this whole time, I'm not thinking about Reina. Or where she's at. The police get there and one of them secures the gun. It's a shotgun. And the other one gets Nacho. And so my husband gets up and they handcuff Nacho on the floor sitting there. And I'm looking down at him and one of them asks, is there anybody else in the house? And that's when I'm like, Reina. I asked Nacho, where's Reina? And he says, she's in her room. So me and my husband run to her room. And her door's locked. But there's a bullet hole through the door. And so my husband moves me and he kicks the door down. And I remember at that point I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see anything. Everything was black. And I looked down and all I see is her leg. And then I saw like smeared blood. And I start screaming. I start screaming, my baby, my baby. I took Nacho to kill her. They had already taken Nacho, and I was yelling at him. And I was telling him that he was gonna fry. And I was banging on the window and I was telling him, you're gonna fry. You're gonna fry for this. I think I was just so sad and broken that I couldn't feel anything for him because I was feeling all these emotions because my baby girl was gone. So for him, I couldn't feel. Never crossed my mind. It never crossed my mind that he would do something like that. The next day, I found out that his plan was to kill the whole family. That he didn't deny anything. He said he did it. And his plans were to kill us all. He never came face to face with her. His room and her bedroom share a wall. And he pointed the gun at the wall and shot and hit her. And then he went around to her bedroom door, but it was locked, and he shot once in there and he hit her again, I believe, through the bedroom door. I feel like I didn't do enough for either one of them. I feel like maybe I should have had an escape plan for Raina in case of an emergency. And for him, I should have done more. Nacho was lost a long time ago. Since her death, everything is different now. Everything that was isn't. It's just not the same. It can't be. Nothing is the same. Everything, every part of my life has changed somehow. I'm changed. I don't like to go anywhere. I just don't feel like doing anything anymore. I don't feel like dealing with people. I just don't. Do I ever look around and basically see my son in some of these kids? Yes. I always do that. Right now, I don't know if you guys saw the little boy that was outside looking for stuff on the ground. I don't know if you guys saw him. I saw my son in him, and I thought to myself, that could be Nacho. I did see him at the bond hearing, but we were behind a window. He was standing there with his arms crossed, kind of like he was like bothered by being there. And I knew that he had planned to kill us, so I did not feel guilty about telling the judge not to let him out.
So this isn't an easy thing for me because I am both his mother and the mother of the victim. So I unfortunately lost 2 kids yesterday. But I do want to ask you to do not release him, Your Honor. I do not feel safe around him.
At that point, all I was feeling was rage. At that point, I hated him. At that point, I wanted him to suffer. Something changed. And I can't tell you when, but I ended up forgiving him. And I forgive him. Some people, I'm sure, are going to ask, how do you forgive him? But he took your daughter's life. But he killed your daughter. It's weird. Because at the same time, you wonder, is Raina going to forgive me? Is Raina even holding that against me? Would Raina want me to have a relationship with him? I don't know how forgiving him helps me. I don't know if it helps me heal. I don't think anything will help me heal. That there's a piece of me missing. So I probably won't get that piece back till I see her again. Oh, excuse me.
Select call from an incarcerated individual at State Prison Complex. This call is not private. It will be recorded and may be monitored. What's up?
Oh, nothing. What are you up to?
I'm waiting for a break. I'm now in an hour.
Oh, you're waiting for rec?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm looking at a picture of you when you're like 5 years old, next to your sister.
Yeah.
Yeah. You guys are on Nana's porch, and she's on a little turquoise. Do you remember that turquoise, like, plastic horsey? That rocking horse?
Yeah.
I'm looking at that picture right now.
There's legal at work.
Brigo is at work.
Yeah.
All right, son, let me let you go because I gotta finish this, okay?
I love you.
Okay, well, you take care of yourself. I love you too, and God bless you.
Alright.
Okay, love you.
Bye.
Bye. I told him I was looking at the picture of him and his sister and asked him if he remembered it, and he says yes. But right away he asked me about his brother, where his brother was at. So I think that's kind of his way of deflecting from the situation. He refuses to talk to me about what he did. I had questions about why, what happened, why, how could you? I still haven't to this day been able to get anything answered, any of my questions answered from him.
Why do you think he did what he did?
That's the $1,000 question. I don't know. Only he knows. I don't know if I'll ever get an answer from him. I'll keep trying. Maybe someday he'll give in. Maybe someday when he gets out and it's easier for him to talk about, maybe he'll give me an answer. I think that it hurts him. And possibly I think that if he allows himself to talk about it, I think he will break down. And I don't think he wants to do that in prison. I don't want him to talk about it if it's gonna hurt him and I'm not able to be with him. Like if it's gonna hurt him and he does something crazy. Heaven forbid.
Have you forgiven yourself?
I don't think I have forgiven myself. I don't know if I ever can. I feel like somebody reached inside of me, pulled out my heart, cut it into pieces, stepped on it, and then danced on it. I have said that I failed. I've said it numerous times that I failed as a mother. I shouldn't be visiting my son in prison. I shouldn't be visiting my daughter at a cemetery. And that's my cross to bear. But I still have hope. I still have hope that someday I will be with my son again. I have hope that one day I'm going to see my daughter again. There's hope. It's not over.
Night falls early over Edmonton. Not the kind of darkness that arrives suddenly, but the slow, heavy kind that seems to seep out of the frozen ground itself. Snow clings to the edges of highways like it has no intention of ever leaving. Streetlights flicker against empty stretches of road where headlights pass like brief, anxious thoughts before disappearing into the distance. Somewhere beyond the city's glow, where suburban grids dissolve into open land, there are places people avoid without ever being told why. They don't call it that officially. There is no sign on a map, no police designation, no single case file labeled with the words that have haunted online forums and late-night conversations. But the phrase exists anyway. Edmonton Killing Fields. A name not born from one crime, but from the accumulation of too many unanswered questions scattered across too many isolated roads. It begins, as these stories often do, with silence. A missing person report that doesn't feel urgent enough at first. A family waiting by a phone that never rings back. A woman who was seen leaving a friend's apartment and never arriving anywhere else that can be confirmed. At the beginning, each case feels separate, manageable, almost ordinary in the unfortunate way missing persons cases can sometimes be in large cities. Edmonton is not a small place. It stretches wide across Alberta, its neighborhoods thinning into industrial zones, its roads stretching toward land that seems endless and indifferent. In the colder months, that land becomes even more unforgiving. Snow flattens everything into uniformity. Trees lose their definition. Ditches disappear under white silence. It is a landscape that does not easily give up its secrets. And that is exactly what makes what happens here so difficult to untangle. At first, investigators treat each disappearance individually. A file is opened. A timeline is constructed. Interviews are conducted in warm kitchens, in fluorescent-lit offices, in parking lots where witnesses try to remember details they did not realize would matter later. Each case has its own rhythm, its own emotional weight, its own set of unanswered questions. A woman last seen near a transit stop on the edge of the city. Another who left a temporary shelter and never returned. Another whose phone last pinged near a stretch of road that leads toward open industrial land. Each story on its own is tragic but not immediately connected to the others. But geography, over time, begins to speak in patterns that human memory does not immediately recognize. The outskirts of Edmonton are vast and uneven. Roads stretch into areas where streetlights become rare and houses disappear entirely. Industrial zones give way to gravel paths, then to fields, then to patches of forest that feel older than the city itself. In summer, these spaces seem simply empty. In winter, they become something else entirely. They become erased. And it is in these erased spaces that the first bodies begin to appear. A discovery along a roadside ditch after the snow begins to melt. A search party following a trail that leads away from a known last sighting. A hiker stumbling upon remains partially hidden beneath brush that had grown undisturbed for months, maybe longer. Each discovery is treated with the procedural urgency of forensic investigation, but emotionally, each one leaves a deeper mark than the last. The details are often similar in their brutality and their ambiguity. Not always identical causes of death, not always identical circumstances, but a recurring sense that these women ended up in places where they were not meant to be found for a very long time. Time becomes an invisible factor in every case. How long were they there? How long did the land keep them before revealing anything at all? What begins to trouble investigators is not just the individual tragedies, but the repetition of environment, the edges of a city, the transitional spaces, the places where development has not yet fully arrived or has long since moved on. Places where visibility drops, where surveillance is non-existent, where witnesses are rare or absent entirely. At first, no one says the words out loud. Not officially, not in reports. Each case still lives in its own folder, its own investigation number, its own isolated narrative. But in quiet conversations between officers, in late-night reviews of maps spread across desks, something begins to form. A pattern that is not yet fully defined, but impossible to completely ignore. It is not just where the bodies are found. It is what those places represent. Distance from central neighborhoods, proximity to highways without being visible from them, access points that do not require specialized knowledge but do require intent, areas that are technically reachable but socially invisible, the kind of places where someone could disappear without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. And always, there are questions that remain unanswered in the same way. How did they get there? Why there specifically? Was it random selection or something more deliberate? As the years pass, the files accumulate. Some cases are solved individually. A partner is identified. A conflict is reconstructed. A narrative is built that explains one disappearance in isolation from the others. Those cases close. The files are archived. Life, for the system at least, moves forward. But not all of them close. Some remain open. Some remain partially explained. Some remain suspended between evidence and uncertainty, never quite resolving into a complete picture. And it is within those unresolved cases that the idea of something larger begins to take shape. Not officially, not in a single report, but in patterns recognized only when enough distance has accumulated. Edmonton Killing Fields is not a label born from certainty. It is a label born from accumulation. A way of describing something that refuses to be contained within a single explanation. A way of naming a fear that grows not from one act, but from the repetition of similar outcomes across time and space. And yet, even as the phrase spreads through media and public imagination, investigators remain cautious. Because patterns can be misleading. Similarity does not always mean connection. Shared geography does not always imply shared cause. In criminology, proximity is not proof. Still, the questions do not disappear. They simply wait. And somewhere beyond the edge of the city, where roads thin out and snow covers everything in a uniform white silence, the landscape remains the same. Wide, quiet, indifferent, holding on to its secrets in places where the world stops watching closely enough to notice when something goes missing. Edmonton does not reveal itself all at once. It unfolds in layers, like an old map slowly exposed under melting snow. To understand why so many stories begin to disappear here, you have to understand the structure of the city itself, not just its center but its edges, where asphalt turns to gravel and residential blocks give way to industrial silence. In daylight, these transitions seem harmless, even ordinary. But under the weight of winter, under the long hours of darkness that stretch across Alberta, they become something else entirely. They become thresholds between visibility and absence. The city core is structured, monitored, alive with movement. Cars pass in steady rhythms, buildings reflect light, people occupy space in predictable patterns. But as you move outward, the rhythm breaks. Streets widen, traffic thins, storefronts become warehouses, warehouses become fence compounds become open land with no clear ownership in sight. It is here, in these in-between zones, that Edmonton begins to feel less like a single city and more like a collection of overlapping worlds that do not fully communicate with one another. For investigators looking back over years of missing persons cases, this geography becomes crucial, because every case, no matter how different in its personal circumstances, seems to share a common final direction. Not a single point on a map, but a general drift toward the periphery, toward places where there are fewer witnesses, fewer cameras, fewer reasons for anyone to be looking closely. The people who disappear in these stories are not defined by a single profile. They are women from different backgrounds, different ages, different life paths. But in the reconstructed files, patterns emerge that are not about identity, but about vulnerability. Temporary housing situations, periods of instability, social isolation, lives intersecting with environments where safety is conditional and attention is fragmented. These are not judgments, but observations repeated across multiple investigations. What makes the Edmonton cases particularly difficult is not only who the victims were, but how quickly they can become statistically invisible in a large urban system. A missing person report enters a queue. Time passes. Other cases arrive. Resources are distributed. Without immediate evidence of foul play, some files move more slowly than others. And in that delay, something critical can be lost: momentum. In several of the cases that later became associated with the so-called Killing Fields narrative, Initial responses were standard. Interviews conducted. Last known locations confirmed. Possible sightings checked. But the geography worked against urgency. A missing person last seen near the outskirts does not offer the same density of surveillance or witness accounts as one seen in a busy downtown area. The further outward the timeline extends, the more space there is for uncertainty to expand. Families often describe the early stages of these investigations in the same way: confusion, followed by waiting, followed by the slow realization that there are no immediate answers coming. Phone calls become less frequent. Updates become more procedural. Hope does not disappear, but it becomes stretched across time, fragile and increasingly dependent on small fragments of information. When bodies began to be discovered in scattered locations outside the city, the emotional landscape of the investigations changed. Each discovery brought confirmation of worst fears, but also raised immediate questions about connection. Were these isolated tragedies occurring in the same general area, or were they linked by something more deliberate? Forensic teams approached each scene with caution, documenting every detail. Soil composition, weather conditions, animal activity, decomposition stages. In a climate like Alberta's, environmental factors play a significant role in how evidence presents itself. Cold temperatures can slow decomposition, preserving certain details longer than expected, while seasonal shifts can erase others entirely. Snowfall can conceal a scene for months. Spring thaw can reveal it in altered condition. This environmental instability complicates time itself as a variable. Establishing when something occurred becomes as challenging as establishing what occurred. And in criminal investigations, time is often the thread that connects everything together. When time becomes uncertain, connections become harder to confirm. As more cases accumulated, analysts began to revisit older files. Not because there was new evidence, but because there was new perspective. Patterns that were not visible in real time became more apparent when viewed collectively. Similar recovery zones, similar demographic vulnerabilities, similar gaps between disappearance and discovery. But even then, the data resisted full consolidation into a single explanatory model. Some investigators argued that the similarities were coincidental, the result of geography and social conditions rather than a single coordinated actor. Others believe the repetition was too consistent to be purely random. The absence of definitive forensic links, however, prevented any unified conclusion. Without physical evidence connecting scenes, the cases remained officially separate. This separation is important because in criminal investigation, classification determines narrative. If cases are separate, they are explained separately. If they are linked, they become part of a larger structure that changes the entire scope of inquiry. In Edmonton, that structural link was never conclusively established. And yet, outside official reports, the idea of connection persisted. In media coverage, in community discussions, in online spaces where information is reconstructed and reinterpreted, the phrase "killing fields" began to carry weight, not as a formal designation, but as a way of expressing something that felt too patterned to ignore, a way of naming unease when certainty was unavailable. For those closest to the investigations, this external narrative created tension, because while patterns can suggest direction, they can also distort perception. Once a label exists, it begins to shape how new information is interpreted. Similar cases are grouped more quickly. Differences are minimized. Expectations begin to influence analysis. This is one of the central challenges in complex investigations, distinguishing between meaningful pattern recognition and narrative reinforcement, between what is truly connected and what appears connected because the mind seeks structure and uncertainty. In Edmonton, that challenge became embedded in the case history itself. Every new disappearance was examined not only for its individual circumstances, but also for how it might fit into an emerging larger picture. And every time a case was solved independently, it complicated that picture further, suggesting fragmentation rather than unity. Still, the sense of unease remained, because even fragmented patterns can feel significant when viewed across enough distance, especially when they occur in the same geographic margins, especially when they involve similar vulnerabilities, especially when the land itself offers so many places where visibility drops away. The edges of Edmonton do not speak loudly. They do not demand attention. They simply exist, stretching outward, absorbing distance, offering space for things to move through unnoticed. And it is within that quiet space that questions continue to accumulate, unresolved but persistent, shaping the way the story of these cases is told and retold over time. Before a case becomes a case, before a name enters a file or a map is marked with a last known location, there is a person who exists in full detail that investigations can never completely preserve. In the stories connected to what people call the Edmonton killing fields, that human layer is often what gets slowly eroded first by time, by fragmentation, and by the distance between disappearance and discovery. Yet behind every report, every statistic, every cold case reference, there were women who lived lives that did not begin or end with the moment they went missing. They were daughters, friends, co-workers, sometimes mothers, sometimes just passing through a difficult phase of life that did not define their entire existence, but did shape how the world interacted with them in their final known moments. To understand the emotional weight of these cases, you have to step away from the geography for a moment and move into something much more intimate, much more fragile, the ordinary days before everything changed. Many of the victims shared something that investigators later described not as a defining identity, but as a shared vulnerability. Not because they were the same, but because their circumstances placed them in environments where risk was harder to see and easier to overlook. Some were navigating unstable housing situations, moving between temporary accommodations, couch surfing, or staying in shelters. Others were trying to rebuild after personal crises, relationships that had broken down, or periods of isolation that made support systems thinner than they once were. But reducing them to vulnerability alone would be a mistake, because each of them had routines, habits, small details that anchored them in the world. One might have always texted a friend before leaving a location. Another might have had a favorite route through the city, a familiar cafe, a daily pattern that gave structure to otherwise unpredictable circumstances. These details rarely survive in official summaries, but they are often the first things families remember when they speak about them. A mother might recall the exact tone of her daughter's voice on a phone call just days before she disappeared, something slightly distracted but still familiar. A friend might remember laughter in a parking lot after a long shift, the kind of ordinary moment that would never seem important until it becomes one of the last confirmed memories. These fragments are not evidence in the legal sense, but they are the emotional architecture of every missing person case. In Edmonton, as these cases accumulated over time, investigators began to notice that many of the missing women were last seen in transitional spaces, not private homes, not densely populated public venues, but places in between. Bus stops at the edge of neighborhoods, parking lots behind commercial strips, side streets that connect major roads to less monitored areas. These are spaces designed for movement rather than presence, places where people pass through rather than remain. And when someone disappears in a place designed for passage, the absence becomes harder to reconstruct. There are fewer fixed points, fewer consistent witnesses, fewer emotional anchors tied to that exact location. This does not explain what happened, but it does explain why reconstructing what happened becomes so difficult. Families, meanwhile, often experience a different kind of geography. For them, the city stops being a map and becomes a series of emotional coordinates. The last phone call, the last known sighting, the last message that seemed ordinary at the time. These moments become fixed points in memory, revisited repeatedly in search of something that might have been missed. In some cases, families reported feeling an early sense that something was wrong before any official confirmation arrived. A delay in communication, a missed routine check-in, a change in behavior that only becomes significant in hindsight. But these intuitions rarely translate into immediate investigative breakthroughs. In large urban systems, early uncertainty is common, and not every absence indicates foul play. That ambiguity, while necessary for procedural caution, can be devastating emotionally. For the victims, whose cases later became associated with the broader killing fields narrative, the period between disappearance and discovery varied widely. Some were found relatively quickly, their cases resolved independently through standard investigation pathways. Others remained missing for months or years, their absence gradually transforming from urgent search to unresolved file. And in a few cases, the delay between disappearance and discovery was so long that reconstruction became dependent on environmental and circumstantial evidence rather than direct testimony. When remains were eventually found, the process of identification itself carried a heavy emotional burden. DNA analysis, dental records, personal effects, all became tools not only of forensic science, but of closure for families who had been living in suspended uncertainty. Yet even identification did not necessarily resolve the deeper questions surrounding the circumstances of death or the path that led to those remote locations. One of the most difficult aspects of these cases is how quickly a life narrative can collapse into a set of procedural facts. Age, last known location, estimated time of disappearance, possible cause of death. These are necessary for investigation, but they cannot contain the full weight of who the person was. The difference between a lived life and a case file is not just informational, it is emotional. Over time, as more cases were reviewed collectively, patterns of similarity became more visible, but so did the individuality of each story. Some victims had recent contact with law enforcement prior to their disappearance. Others had no prior involvement at all. Some were last seen alone, others in social environments. Some cases involved confirmed criminal activity, others remained unclear even after extensive review. This variation complicates any attempt to unify them under a single explanatory framework. Still, the persistence of geographic clustering continued to draw attention. The edges of Edmonton, the transitional zones between developed urban space and open land, repeatedly appeared in these narratives. These are not spaces that naturally attract attention unless something forces them into visibility. And in these cases, visibility came only after absence had already occurred. For families, the geography of loss often becomes fixed in memory in ways that are deeply personal. A highway exit that once meant nothing becomes a point of emotional weight. A stretch of road becomes a place avoided. Even without knowing exactly what happened, the association between place and absence becomes permanent. As investigators and analysts worked through these cases over time, one of the recurring challenges was balancing statistical observation with human specificity. Patterns can be identified, but they risk flattening individual lives into data points. And yet ignoring patterns entirely can also obscure potential connections. This tension runs through every discussion of the Edmonton cases. What remains clear, however, is that each victim existed in full complexity before becoming part of any broader narrative. They were not defined by their disappearance. They were defined by the lives they lived before that moment, even if those details are gradually overshadowed by the circumstances of their absence. And in the quiet aftermath of each case, long after files are archived or reclassified, what lingers most strongly is not the geography or the pattern, but the unresolved distance between who they were and what remains of them in the records that attempt, imperfectly, to represent their stories. There is a moment in every disappearance case when routine ends and uncertainty begins, but no one can agree exactly when that moment happens in real time. It is only afterward, when timelines are reconstructed and last sightings are pinned to specific hours or places, that the shift becomes visible. In the cases associated with what is now referred to as the Edmonton killing fields, that shift often occurs in spaces that seem, at first glance, entirely unremarkable. A bus stop at the edge of a commercial district, a parking lot behind a strip of clothes shops, a stretch of sidewalk where traffic noise fades into the distance and the city feels temporarily unfinished. On paper, each incident begins differently. A woman leaving a known location, a confirmed phone signal near a transit corridor, a final conversation that does not suggest danger in any obvious form. But as investigators later reconstruct these moments, a pattern emerges not in the details themselves, but in what follows them: a sudden break in continuity. A disappearance not marked by dramatic escalation, but by silence that arrives faster than anyone expects. The early hours of these cases are often shaped by assumption. Friends believe the missing person has gone somewhere temporary. Family members wait for a message that feels slightly delayed but still normal within the rhythms of modern life. Even initial police responses, unless immediate evidence suggests foul play, must operate within a framework that avoids premature conclusions. This creates a fragile period where nothing is confirmed, but everything is possible. In Edmonton, this fragile period is complicated by geography. The city does not end cleanly. It dissolves gradually into industrial corridors, service roads, and open land that stretches outward without clear boundaries. In winter, visibility decreases not only because of darkness, but because of uniformity. Snow covers landmarks. Roads look similar. Distances become harder to judge. A person moving through these spaces at the wrong time can become untraceable not because they vanished suddenly, but because the environment offers too many places where observation breaks down. When the first bodies connected to this broader pattern were discovered, investigators initially treated each case as independent. The forensic teams approached each scene with standard procedure, documenting environmental conditions, collecting physical evidence, and establishing estimated timelines. But even in those early examinations, certain consistencies were difficult to ignore. The remoteness of locations, the lack of immediate witnesses, the way some scenes appeared undisturbed for extended periods before discovery. One of the most challenging aspects of these investigations was the delay between disappearance and recovery. In some cases, that delay stretched across seasons. A person last seen in late autumn might not be found until the thaw of spring reveals what winter had concealed. This temporal gap is not just a forensic challenge. It reshapes the entire structure of investigation. Evidence degrades. Witness memory weakens. Surveillance records, if they exist at all, are often overwritten or lost. As more cases accumulated, analysts began to overlay timelines and maps, not to immediately connect them, but to look for any meaningful intersections. What they found was not a single concentrated point, but a scattered pattern of proximity. Locations that were not identical, but shared similar characteristics. Transitional zones, peripheral roads, areas where residential density dropped sharply and industrial or undeveloped land began. However, even as these similarities became more visible, caution remained essential. Similar geography does not automatically indicate shared causation. Edmonton's outskirts are large, and the conditions that create vulnerability are not exclusive to a single actor or method. This is why, even as public discourse began to frame the cases under a collective label, official investigations continued to treat them with individual precision. The difficulty lay in reconciling two truths that did not easily align. On one hand, there were clear patterns of vulnerability and geography that suggested something systematic in how these disappearances occurred or were concealed. On the other hand, there was a lack of definitive forensic linkage between cases that would justify a unified investigative theory. No single piece of physical evidence tied the incidents together conclusively. This gap between perception and proof became one of the defining features of the Edmonton cases. In public understanding, patterns often feel like connection. In investigative standards, connection requires evidence that meets a much higher threshold. Between these two perspectives lies a space where uncertainty grows. During the course of investigations, multiple hypotheses were considered. Some focused on individual offenders operating independently in overlapping territories. Others explored the possibility of opportunistic crimes occurring in geographically similar areas due to environmental vulnerability rather than coordinated action. Each theory explained part of the data, but none explained all of it without leaving significant gaps. Meanwhile, the emotional pressure on investigators and families continued to build. Each new discovery carried the weight of both resolution and renewed uncertainty. A body found could close one file, but it could also reopen questions about whether others remained undiscovered. Closure, in this context, was never absolute. It was partial, conditional, and often temporary. As forensic technology improved over time, older cases were revisited. DNA analysis, once limited, became more precise. Databases expanded, allowing cross-referencing between previously unrelated investigations. In some instances, new information clarified individual cases that had remained unsolved for years. But even these advancements did not produce a unifying breakthrough that could definitively define the entire pattern. What emerged instead was a more complex understanding of fragmentation. Each case existed within its own set of circumstances, yet certain environmental and social conditions overlapped. This overlap created the appearance of continuity without necessarily confirming direct linkage. It is a distinction that is easy to overlook but critical in forensic reasoning. In the field, investigators often describe the Edmonton outskirts as a landscape of transitions. Not fully urban, not fully rural. A space where visibility is inconsistent and where human presence is intermittent. It is precisely this transitional nature that makes these areas difficult to monitor continuously. Movement through such zones does not always leave a trace that can be easily reconstructed after the fact. As the investigation evolved, so did the language used to describe it. Early reports focused on individual disappearances. Later analyses began to incorporate broader geographic and behavioral observations. Eventually, informal terminology emerged, capturing the collective anxiety surrounding the cases. But within official structures, precision remained the priority, even when public perception leaned toward simplification. The tension between these two approaches, collective narrative versus individual case analysis, remains one of the central challenges in understanding what happened across these years. Because while the idea of a single unified explanation is emotionally compelling, the data itself resists easy consolidation. What remains undeniable is that a series of disappearances and discoveries occurred within a relatively defined geographic region over a span of time, involving individuals who shared certain vulnerability profiles and who were last seen in environments that limited visibility and traceability. Beyond that, interpretation becomes more complex, shaped by the limits of evidence and the structure of investigative methodology. And so the incident phase, when viewed as a whole, does not form a single linear story. It forms instead a mosaic of separate events, each complete in its own procedural frame, but collectively pointing toward questions that remain open even as individual cases reach their legal or forensic conclusions. The first discoveries do not arrive with clarity. They arrive with hesitation, confusion, and a kind of procedural disbelief that even experienced investigators cannot fully avoid. In the cases tied to what would later be discussed under the umbrella of the Edmonton killing fields, the earliest confirmed findings were not immediately understood as part of a larger pattern. Each discovery was treated as an isolated event, a separate tragedy unfolding in a city already accustomed to handling difficult cases across a wide and complex jurisdiction. It usually begins with a call, a report of remains found in an area far from routine pedestrian traffic, a stretch of roadside where the snow has begun to melt unevenly, revealing shapes that do not belong in the landscape, a search team following a lead that was never meant to confirm the worst possible outcome, yet gradually becomes exactly that. In those moments, time behaves differently. The urgency of the search shifts instantly into the stillness of recovery. The first officers on scene often describe a silence that feels heavier than the environment itself. Edmonton's outskirts are already quiet, especially in colder months, but there is a difference between natural quiet and investigative silence. Natural quiet belongs to the land. Investigative silence belongs to something unresolved. It is the moment when movement stops, radios become more deliberate, and every step forward feels like it must be measured against something unseen. The initial forensic response follows a strict protocol. The area is secured, documented, and divided into zones of examination. Photographs are taken from multiple angles, not only to capture evidence, but to preserve the environment exactly as it is found. Weather conditions are recorded with precision because in Alberta those conditions are never neutral. Wind, temperature, and snow coverage all influence how a scene must be interpreted later. In many of these cases, the first challenge is identification. Depending on the state of the remains and the time elapsed since death, confirmation can take days, weeks, or longer. During that period, the discovery exists in a suspended state. It is real enough to alter investigative priorities, but incomplete enough to resist full narrative definition. Families may already be searching for missing loved ones without knowing that a discovery has been made that could change everything, or nothing, depending on the outcome of forensic analysis. As identification begins to take shape, the emotional structure of the case changes. A missing person becomes a confirmed victim, and the language of investigation shifts accordingly. But even this transition does not resolve the central uncertainty of these cases, which is not just who the person was, but how they ended up in these specific locations. The sites themselves vary, but they share a consistent characteristic: distance from immediate observation. Some are near service roads that branch off major highways, invisible unless specifically sought. Others are deeper within undeveloped land where pathways are informal and signage is non-existent. A few are located near industrial perimeters where human presence is intermittent and largely functional rather than residential. These are not places where people naturally gather. They are places people pass through or avoid entirely. In the earliest investigations, each site was documented independently. There was no immediate assumption of connection. This is standard practice in forensic work, where each scene must first be understood on its own terms before any broader interpretation can be responsibly considered. But even within that structured approach, certain similarities began to stand out to those reviewing multiple files over time. One of the most consistent features was the absence of clear immediate witnesses. These were not locations where activity was regularly observed or recorded. Surveillance infrastructure was limited or non-existent in many of the areas involved. This absence created a significant gap between when individuals were last seen and when they were eventually found. That gap became one of the most difficult aspects of reconstruction. Another recurring element was the environmental interaction with time. In Alberta, seasonal changes have a profound effect on forensic recovery. Winter can preserve evidence in ways that delay discovery, while spring thaw can expose what was previously hidden. This creates a temporal distortion in investigation timelines. A case may appear to have occurred recently when in reality it has been concealed for months. This distortion complicates efforts to establish accurate sequences of events. As more cases were processed, investigators began to compare notes across jurisdictions and timeframes, not to unify the cases prematurely, but to ensure that no detail was overlooked that might indicate broader relevance. This comparative review revealed similarities in patterns of disappearance prior to discovery, but also significant differences in individual circumstances, which prevented immediate consolidation into a single investigative framework. Some victims were last seen in social environments. Others disappeared after leaving private residences or temporary accommodations. Some cases involved known associates, while others showed no clear interpersonal connection at the time of disappearance. This variability complicated any attempt to define a singular behavioral or operational pattern. Despite this, the repetition of geographic characteristics remained difficult to ignore. The edges of Edmonton, particularly transitional zones between urban infrastructure and undeveloped land, appeared repeatedly in the dataset of discovery locations. These were not identical points, but they shared environmental qualities that made them structurally similar in terms of visibility, access, and isolation. However, investigators remained cautious. Similarity in environment does not establish causation. It only suggests conditions under which certain events may be more likely to remain undetected or unresolved for longer periods. This distinction is critical in avoiding premature conclusions that could misdirect investigative resources. As the number of cases grew, so did public attention. Media coverage began to group incidents together under informal labels, creating a narrative structure that emphasized connection. This external framing influenced public perception significantly, even as official investigations continued to treat each case independently unless direct evidence of linkage could be established. For families, the discovery of remains was both an end and a beginning. It ended the uncertainty of not knowing whether their loved one was alive, but it began a new phase of uncertainty about what had actually happened. Closure in a legal or procedural sense does not always translate into emotional resolution. The absence remains, now defined more concretely but no less painfully. In reviewing the early discovery phase as a whole, what emerges is not a single pattern of crime, but a pattern of conditions. Conditions that include geographic isolation, environmental concealment, temporal delay, and investigative fragmentation. These conditions do not explain causation, but they define the framework within which these cases unfolded. And within that framework, each discovery stands as both an answer and a question. An answer to what happened to a specific individual. A question about how many more cases may share similar characteristics without yet having been fully understood or connected. As the number of missing persons cases and discoveries around Edmonton began to accumulate, the investigation naturally shifted into its most complex phase, identifying suspects, testing theories, and confronting dead ends that often led nowhere definitive. This is the stage where uncertainty becomes structured, where speculation is filtered through procedure, and where every potential lead must survive the weight of evidence before it can be considered credible. In the cases later associated with the Edmonton killing field's narrative, this phase did not produce a single coherent suspect profile. Instead, it produced fragments, overlapping hypotheses, and a growing awareness that the truth might not conform to a simple narrative at all. At first, investigators approached each case with the standard framework used in missing persons and homicide investigations. The most immediate focus was always on people closest to the victim: partners, ex-partners, acquaintances, individuals who had last seen the victim alive. In several cases, this approach did yield answers, but those answers tended to resolve individual files rather than illuminate a broader pattern. A domestic conflict here, a personal dispute there, isolated incidents that explained singular outcomes but did not connect to the larger geographic clustering that had begun to concern analysts reviewing the cases collectively. As more time passed, attention expanded beyond immediate social circles. Investigators began to examine transient individuals, known offenders operating in peripheral areas, and those with prior histories of violence or exploitation-related offenses. Edmonton's size and its surrounding regions meant that there was no shortage of individuals who warranted attention at one point or another during these investigations. Yet every time a suspect appeared promising, the evidentiary trail would eventually weaken. Alibis would hold, forensic links would fail to materialize, or timelines would not align with known facts. One of the major difficulties in this phase was the fragmentation of evidence across time and jurisdiction. Because the cases occurred over several years, sometimes in different administrative regions or under different investigative teams, information was not always centralized from the beginning. What might have appeared insignificant in one file could have been relevant in another, but the connection was not always immediately visible. This created gaps that later reviews attempted to bridge, often with limited success. There were also instances where individuals were considered strong suspects based on behavioral patterns or proximity to multiple incidents. These cases often generated significant investigative effort, including interviews, background checks, and forensic comparisons. Yet even in these stronger leads, the absence of direct physical evidence linking a person to multiple scenes made it impossible to elevate suspicion into formal charges. The legal threshold required for prosecution remained firmly grounded in verifiable proof, not pattern-based inference alone. As investigative pressure increased, so did the number of false starts. Some leads emerged from witness recollections that later proved inconsistent or unreliable under further scrutiny. Others came from circumstantial associations that initially seemed compelling but dissolved when tested against verified timelines. Each dead end required resources to be reallocated, slowing the overall progression of the investigation and reinforcing the fragmented nature of the cases. Parallel to official investigative work, alternative theories began to circulate in public discourse. The idea of a single serial offender operating across the outskirts of Edmonton gained traction in media narratives and online discussions. This theory was appealing in its simplicity, as it offered a unifying explanation for geographically clustered but individually complex cases. However, within investigative circles, this hypothesis remained unconfirmed due to the lack of consistent forensic linkage. Without DNA matches, ballistic connections, or verified patterns of modus operandi that could be reliably attributed to a single actor, the theory remained speculative. Other interpretations suggested multiple offenders operating independently within the same vulnerable geographic zones. This model, while less narratively satisfying, aligned more closely with the diversity of evidence across cases. It accounted for differences in victim profiles, methods of disappearance, and circumstances of discovery. However, it also made the investigative landscape significantly more complicated, as it required the possibility of parallel crimes occurring without direct relation, unified only by environmental opportunity. Environmental conditions themselves became an important factor in evaluating suspect viability. The outskirts of Edmonton provide extensive areas where activity can go unnoticed for extended periods. Industrial corridors, undeveloped land, and transitional zones between urban and rural space create conditions where surveillance is limited and witness presence is inconsistent. These factors do not point to a specific suspect, but they do shape the environment in which potential offenders could operate without immediate detection. Throughout this phase, investigators also had to contend with the passage of time affecting both evidence and memory. Witness statements collected years after initial events often lacked precision, not because of dishonesty, but because human memory naturally degrades and reconstructs over time. This made it difficult to rely on retrospective accounts as primary evidence, even when they provided useful contextual direction. In some cases, Persons of interest were re-evaluated multiple times as new analytical methods became available. Advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA analysis and digital data recovery, allowed older evidence to be re-examined with greater sensitivity. However, even with improved technology, many of the critical pieces required to establish definitive links between suspect and multiple scenes remained absent. As investigative teams moved deeper into this phase, a recurring realization began to take shape. The challenge was not a lack of potential suspects, but a lack of convergence. There were many plausible directions, many reasonable hypotheses, but very few points where all lines of inquiry intersected with sufficient clarity to support decisive conclusions. The investigative landscape resembled a wide field of partially connected threads rather than a single linear path. This fragmentation did not mean that progress was impossible, but it did change the nature of progress itself. Instead of moving toward a single breakthrough moment, the investigation became a process of narrowing uncertainty, eliminating implausible explanations, and refining understanding of what could and could not be confirmed. It was methodical work, but not always satisfying work, especially in the absence of closure. For families and the public observing from the outside, this phase often appeared slower and less visible than earlier stages. Without major announcements or definitive breakthroughs, it could seem as though the investigation was stalled. In reality, much of the work was occurring in analysis, cross-referencing, and re-evaluation of existing data rather than in dramatic field developments. By the end of this phase, the central tension of the Edmonton cases became clear. There was no shortage of hypotheses, no shortage of investigative effort, and no shortage of isolated resolutions. What remained missing was a unifying, evidentiary structure strong enough to transform pattern into certainty. And in that absence, the investigation continued forward not toward a single confirmed suspect, but toward increasingly refined boundaries of what the truth might plausibly be. The breakthrough, when it finally arrives in investigations like these, rarely resembles the kind of dramatic revelation people imagine from films or public narratives. It is not a sudden confession that resolves everything in a single moment, nor a single piece of evidence that instantly connects all missing points into a perfect line. In the Edmonton cases, what later came to be described as a breakthrough was far more subtle, gradual, and structurally complicated. It emerged not from one discovery, but from the slow convergence of re-examined files, technological advancement, and a shift in how investigators began to interpret fragmented patterns that had existed for years without being fully understood. The turning point began quietly within the routine but increasingly important process of cold case review. As new forensic technologies became available, older evidence was revisited with methods that had not existed at the time of initial collection. DNA profiles that were once incomplete or unusable were reanalyzed with improved sensitivity. Trace evidence that had previously been considered inconclusive was re-examined under updated protocols. This process did not immediately produce dramatic results, but it began to refine the edges of uncertainty that had surrounded several of the Edmonton cases for years. What emerged first was not a single match, but a pattern of elimination. Certain assumptions that had guided early investigations were no longer supported when retested under modern forensic standards. Some previously considered possibilities regarding timing of death were adjusted. In other cases, environmental contamination that had once obscured evidence could now be partially accounted for. These adjustments did not solve the cases, but they narrowed the range of plausible interpretations in meaningful ways. At the same time, analysts working across multiple files began to identify subtle overlaps that had not been formally connected before. These were not direct forensic links, but consistencies in environmental interaction, recovery conditions, and geographic clustering that became more significant when viewed through updated mapping systems and data aggregation tools. For the first time, investigators were able to visualize the cases not just individually, but as part of a broader spatial distribution that suggested repeated activity within certain transitional zones around Edmonton. This was where the nature of the investigation began to change. Previously, each case had been treated primarily as an independent event with its own investigative trajectory. But the updated analyses encouraged a shift in perspective, one that allowed for comparative evaluation without prematurely assuming causation. It was a careful balance between recognizing pattern and avoiding overinterpretation. And within that balance, the idea of a potential interconnected structure began to gain cautious credibility among certain investigative teams. One of the most significant developments during this phase came from the reorganization of historical case data into a unified analytical framework. This did not merge the cases officially, but it allowed investigators to examine them side by side with consistent variables: last known sightings, environmental conditions, discovery locations, and temporal gaps between disappearance and recovery. When viewed collectively in this structured format, certain consistencies became more visible than they had been in isolated files. These consistencies included repeated use of peripheral zones outside the central urban area, recurring delays in discovery that aligned with seasonal environmental changes, and a disproportionate number of cases involving individuals whose last known movements placed them in transitional spaces between monitored and unmonitored environments. None of these factors individually proved connection, but together they created a framework that required deeper interpretation. As this analytical model developed, attention also returned to previously examined persons of interest, not in the sense of reopening concluded investigations, but in reassessing whether earlier exclusions had been based on incomplete data. In some instances, older alibi structures were re-evaluated in light of new timelines. In others, partial inconsistencies that had once been dismissed as insignificant were reconsidered as potentially relevant within a broader pattern-based analysis. However, even with this renewed scrutiny, no single individual or group emerged with sufficient evidentiary weight to be identified as a central causal factor across multiple cases. What made this phase particularly complex was the coexistence of clarity and limitation. On one hand, investigators now had a more structured understanding of how and where the cases clustered geographically and temporally. On the other hand, the critical missing element remained unchanged: a definitive evidentiary link that could transform analytical correlation into legal certainty. Without that link, the investigation could refine understanding but could not conclusively unify responsibility. Another important aspect of this period was the increased integration of interdisciplinary expertise. Forensic analysts worked more closely with geographic information specialists, behavioral experts, and data scientists to construct more sophisticated models of case distribution. These models helped identify areas of higher investigative interest and provided a clearer picture of how environmental factors may have influenced both detection and delay. However, even these advanced models reinforced the same central limitation: patterns could be observed, but causation remained unproven. Public awareness during this time also began to shift. As media coverage revisited older cases in light of renewed analytical interest, the idea of a breakthrough was often interpreted more broadly than the investigation itself intended. In public discourse, the term suggested resolution or imminent closure. Within investigative reality, it referred instead to incremental progress in understanding structure rather than achieving final answers. This divergence between perception and procedure created ongoing tension between external expectations and internal caution. Within the investigative teams themselves, the breakthrough was not experienced as a single moment, but as a gradual realization. It was the recognition that the cases, while not conclusively linked, could no longer be fully understood in isolation. The environment, the timing patterns, and the distribution of vulnerability profiles suggested a level of systemic consistency that warranted continued collective analysis. At the same time, the absence of direct forensic linkage required that each case remain legally independent. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a new conceptual position. It was no longer operating under purely fragmented assumptions, but it had not achieved unified resolution either. It existed in a structured middle ground, where pattern recognition had improved significantly, but evidentiary certainty still defined the limits of action. The breakthrough, in its true form, was therefore not the identification of a single answer, but the transformation of how the question itself was understood. Instead of asking whether all cases were connected by one actor or entirely separate, investigators began to ask more precise questions about degrees of relation, environmental influence, and systemic vulnerability. And within that shift, the investigation moved forward, not toward closure, but toward a more refined understanding of what could realistically be known. The courtroom phase in cases like those associated with the Edmonton killing fields is often imagined as the moment where chaos is finally contained, where uncertainty is resolved into verdicts, and where every unanswered question receives a definitive response. In reality, what unfolds inside the legal system is far more constrained, shaped not by narrative completeness, but by evidentiary thresholds that determine what can and cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt. In this particular set of cases, that distinction became the defining feature of everything that followed. When individual cases reached court, they did so separately, each carrying its own evidentiary record, its own witnesses, and its own limitations. There was no single consolidated trial, no unified proceeding that addressed the broader pattern suggested in public discourse. Instead, the legal system treated each case as an independent unit of prosecution, consistent with its requirement that guilt must be established through direct, admissible, and reliable evidence tied to specific incidents. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was markedly different from the fragmented uncertainty of the investigative phase. Here, everything had structure. Testimony was presented in sequence. Forensic findings were introduced under strict procedural rules. Cross-examinations were conducted with precision, each question designed to test the reliability of memory, the integrity of evidence, or the consistency of prior statements. But even within this structured environment, the underlying complexity of the Edmonton cases remained present, just more tightly contained. In cases where suspects were brought to trial for individual incidents, the prosecution's burden was clear: establish a direct connection between the accused and the specific act in question. This required physical evidence, credible witness testimony, or a combination of both that could withstand rigorous legal scrutiny. In several instances, while circumstantial evidence raised suspicion, it did not meet the threshold required for conviction. The absence of definitive forensic linkage between multiple cases meant that each trial stood on its own evidentiary foundation, without support from broader pattern-based inference. Defense strategies often focused on this very fragmentation. Where investigations had explored patterns across multiple cases, defense arguments emphasized the importance of isolating each incident legally and avoiding the influence of external narratives that were not directly admissible in court. This approach reinforced the legal principle that suspicion, even when shaped by repeated geographic or demographic patterns, cannot replace concrete proof. Forensic experts who testified in these proceedings were careful to distinguish between what could be scientifically established and what remained interpretive. DNA evidence, where available, provided strong anchors in specific cases, but such evidence was not consistently present across the broader set of incidents. Environmental conditions, degradation of physical material over time, and delays in discovery all contributed to limitations in what could be definitively reconstructed. Witness testimony, another critical component of these trials, presented its own challenges. Many witnesses were recalling events that had occurred months or years earlier, sometimes under stressful or uncertain circumstances. While their accounts often provided valuable context, the defense frequently highlighted inconsistencies or gaps that naturally arise in human memory over time. The court, in turn, had to weigh these testimonies carefully, considering both their emotional weight and their evidentiary reliability. In cases where convictions were achieved, they were based on specific, localized evidence rather than any broader interpretation of a regional pattern. These outcomes resolved individual legal questions, but did not extend into conclusions about the wider series of cases that had captured public attention. As a result, even successful prosecutions did not produce the kind of overarching resolution that many outside observers expected. In cases that did not result in conviction, the verdicts often reflected the core limitation of the entire investigative history, the gap between suspicion and proof. Judges and juries were required to operate strictly within the boundaries of admissible evidence, and when that evidence was insufficient to eliminate reasonable doubt, acquittals followed. These outcomes were not statements about what did or did not happen in a broader sense, but rather about what could be proven within the specific legal framework of each trial. Meanwhile, the broader narrative surrounding the Edmonton cases continued to exist outside the courtroom. Public perception, shaped by years of media coverage and informal discourse, often expected the trials to address the larger pattern of disappearances and discoveries. However, the legal system does not operate on narrative completeness. It operates on case-specific accountability. This structural difference created a persistent disconnect between judicial outcomes and public expectation. For families of victims, courtroom proceedings represented a complex emotional experience. On one hand, they offered a formal recognition of harm and a structured space in which evidence was presented and examined. On the other hand, they often did not deliver the comprehensive answers that families sought regarding the broader context of their loved ones' cases. Even when a verdict was reached, it did not necessarily resolve the deeper questions surrounding how similar cases across the region might or might not be connected. In the context of the Edmonton investigations, one of the most significant limitations exposed during this phase was the inability of legal proceedings to incorporate pattern-based reasoning without direct evidentiary linkage. While investigators could observe geographic clustering or behavioral similarities across cases, courts required direct attribution to specific incidents. This distinction ensured legal rigor but also constrained the scope of what could be formally concluded. As a result, the courtroom phase functioned less as a final resolution of the broader phenomenon and more as a series of isolated endpoints within a much larger unresolved system. Each case concluded within its own legal boundaries, but the collective narrative remained open in the broader investigative and analytical context. By the end of this phase, it became clear that justice, as defined within the courtroom, operates on a different scale than understanding, as pursued within investigation and analysis. The courtroom can determine responsibility for specific acts under specific conditions, but it cannot fully resolve complex multi-case patterns that lack direct evidentiary continuity. In the Edmonton cases, this distinction became one of the most important structural realities of the entire process. And so, while verdicts were delivered and individual files were closed, the larger questions that had emerged over years of investigation remained outside the reach of judicial conclusion, existing instead in the space between what could be proven and what could only be observed. In the aftermath of investigations, court proceedings, and years of fragmented analysis, what remains in the Edmonton cases is not a final answer, but a landscape of unresolved meaning. Time has not erased the questions that first surrounded the disappearances. Instead, it has reshaped them into something more complex, less urgent in appearance but no less persistent in substance. The files are no longer active in the way they once were, yet they are far from forgotten. They exist in a state that is neither closure nor continuation, but something in between, held together by evidence, memory, and the limits of what can be definitively proven. For the families, the passage of time has created a dual reality. Life continues in practical terms, shaped by work, relationships, and the demands of everyday existence. Yet beneath that surface continuity, there remains a permanent absence that does not diminish. The moment of disappearance becomes a fixed point in personal history, one that does not evolve or resolve, but instead becomes integrated into identity itself. Anniversaries are marked quietly. Conversations revisit old details. Small memories carry disproportionate emotional weight because they are among the few remaining connections to a life that can no longer produce new ones. In the broader public memory, the phrase Edmonton killing fields persists, but its meaning has shifted over time. What once suggested a possible unified explanation has become more of a symbolic reference to uncertainty itself. It represents not a confirmed structure of events, but the discomfort that arises when multiple tragedies share geography without sharing a provable cause. It reflects the human tendency to search for cohesion in fragmentation, to seek patterns even when those patterns resist confirmation. Within academic and investigative circles, the cases continue to be referenced as examples of structural complexity in missing persons investigations. They are studied not for a single conclusion, but for the layered challenges they present, the limitations of environmental conditions on evidence preservation, the effects of geographic transition zones on detection probability, and the tension between pattern recognition and evidentiary standards. In this sense, the Edmonton cases have become less about resolution and more about methodology, shaping how future investigations approach similar conditions. One of the most enduring lessons from these cases is the importance of scale and interpretation. When viewed individually, each case carries its own explanation, its own circumstances, and its own internal logic. When viewed collectively, they suggest patterns that are harder to dismiss but equally difficult to confirm. This duality is not a contradiction, but a reflection of how complex systems behave when multiple independent variables overlap within the same environment. The geography of Edmonton itself remains unchanged in its fundamental structure. The city still expands outward, still transitions into industrial corridors, still dissolves into open land where visibility decreases and human presence becomes sporadic. These physical characteristics are not inherently linked to criminal activity, but they do shape the conditions under which certain events become more difficult to observe, document, or reconstruct. Over time, this environmental reality has become part of how the cases are understood, even if it does not provide direct answers. Technological advancement continues to offer new possibilities for revisiting old evidence. Cold case databases grow more sophisticated. Analytical tools become more precise. DNA technologies continue to evolve, sometimes allowing partial reconstructions of events that were previously inaccessible. Yet even with these advancements, there is no guarantee that every unanswered question will eventually find resolution. Some cases may yield new insights. Others may remain unchanged, locked within the limits of what was preserved at the time. The emotional dimension, however, does not evolve in the same way as the technical one. For those directly affected, uncertainty is not a data problem that can be optimized or resolved through improved methodology. It is a lived condition that persists regardless of investigative progress. Even when cases are officially closed or reclassified, the absence they represent does not disappear. It simply becomes part of a longer, more complex narrative of coping and remembrance. Over time, the language used to describe these cases has softened in some contexts and intensified in others. In official documentation, precision remains the priority. In public discourse, symbolic language often takes precedence. Between these two forms of expression lies a gap that reflects the broader challenge of translating complex investigative realities into shared understanding. What the Edmonton cases ultimately demonstrate is that not all patterns resolve into single explanations. Some patterns exist because multiple systems overlap in ways that create visual or geographic similarity without requiring direct connection. Others may hint at deeper relationships that remain unproven due to limitations in evidence, time, or circumstance. Distinguishing between these possibilities is one of the most difficult tasks in long-term investigations, and it is one that does not always yield definitive outcomes. In the end, what remains is not a final verdict on the meaning of all events grouped under the Edmonton killing field's narrative, but a structured acknowledgement of their complexity. Each case retains its individual reality, each discovery retains its specific context, and the broader pattern remains an open question, defined as much by what is known as by what cannot yet be confirmed. The story, therefore, does not conclude in the traditional sense. It settles into a different kind of ending, one that is stable in its current form but not absolute in its finality. It is an ending shaped by evidence, limited by absence, and carried forward by memory. And within that balance, the Edmonton cases continue to exist, not as a single closed chapter, but as a reminder of how investigation, geography, and human uncertainty can intersect without ever fully resolving into one clear answer. There is a stage in long-running investigations where the case stops expanding in visible ways but continues to evolve internally in the minds of those who worked it, those who were affected by it, and those who study it afterward. The Edmonton cases, often grouped under the informal and unsettling label of the killing fields, have entered precisely that stage. The active urgency of discovery has faded, the courtroom phase has concluded its limited functions, and what remains is a layered structure of interpretation that continues to shift depending on perspective rather than new evidence. In this final analytical layer, the question is no longer simply what happened, but how meaning is constructed around events that resist complete explanation. Over time, investigators, analysts, and researchers have revisited the Edmonton cases not to reopen them in a procedural sense, but to understand why they generated such a persistent sense of unresolved pattern. This reflection has become as important as the original investigative work itself because it reveals how human perception responds to fragmented tragedy. One of the most consistent observations in retrospective analysis is that the emotional weight of the Edmonton cases is not derived solely from the number of incidents or even from their individual severity, but from their distribution across space and time. When events are scattered across a wide geographic area yet share certain environmental similarities, the human mind naturally searches for connection. This cognitive tendency is not an error, it is a survival mechanism designed to detect patterns in uncertainty. However, in complex systems like large urban regions, it can also lead to interpretations that exceed what evidence can firmly support. As analysts revisit the mapped data of these cases, they often describe a tension between visual coherence and evidentiary fragmentation. On a map, the points appear to form clusters along the edges of urban development, suggesting directional consistency. But when each point is examined individually, the supporting evidence for unified causation weakens. This contradiction does not invalidate either perspective. Instead, it highlights the difference between spatial interpretation and forensic confirmation. In modern criminological study, the Edmonton cases are often referenced as an example of what is sometimes called pattern-sensitive ambiguity. This refers to situations in which repeated structural similarities exist across cases without sufficient direct linkage to establish a single source. It is a condition where both connection and independence remain simultaneously plausible, depending on the level of analysis applied. At a macro level, patterns appear meaningful. At a micro level, cases remain distinct and self-contained. This duality has significant implications for how cold cases are understood more broadly. It challenges the assumption that repeated similarity necessarily implies unified causation. It also reinforces the importance of distinguishing between environmental correlation and behavioral linkage. In Edmonton, the geography of the city's outskirts played a central role in shaping this interpretive complexity. The transitional zones between urban density and open land created consistent conditions of low visibility, but they did not in themselves provide evidence of coordinated action. Over time, technological improvements have allowed investigators to revisit certain aspects of the cases with greater precision. Enhanced DNA analysis, improved geospatial mapping, and more integrated data systems have all contributed to a clearer understanding of individual incidents. Yet even with these advancements, the fundamental limitation remains unchanged. Not all historical evidence was preserved in a way that allows for complete reconstruction. Some gaps are technical, others are temporal, and some are simply the result of information never having been recorded in the first place. From a sociological perspective, the enduring attention given to the Edmonton cases also reflects broader anxieties about urban edges and transitional spaces. These are areas that exist between categories, not fully urban, not fully rural, often lightly monitored, and frequently changing in character over time. Such spaces challenge conventional assumptions about safety, visibility, and control. The cases that occurred within or near these zones became symbols of that uncertainty, regardless of whether they were causally connected in the way public narratives often suggest. Another important dimension in retrospective study is the role of narrative consolidation. Over time, separate events that share superficial similarities tend to be grouped together in collective memory. This process simplifies complexity into more manageable forms, but it can also obscure important distinctions between individual cases. In the Edmonton context, the term killing fields functions less as a precise analytical label and more as a narrative container for a set of unresolved tensions between pattern and proof. For those directly involved in the original investigations, reflection often centers on the limits of investigative possibility rather than the absence of effort. The work conducted across multiple years, jurisdictions, and technological eras was extensive and methodical. Yet it was constrained by the realities of evidence degradation, jurisdictional fragmentation, and the inherent unpredictability of human behavior. These constraints are not failures of process, but characteristics of complex investigative environments. What remains particularly significant in long-term reflection is the recognition that not all investigative questions are designed to reach definitive closure. Some questions evolve into case studies about methodology, uncertainty, and interpretation rather than about final attribution. The Edmonton cases now occupy that category. They are no longer active investigations in most respects, but they continue to inform how similar situations are approached, analyzed, and understood. In the end, the legacy of these cases is not defined by a single answer, but by the way they illustrate the boundaries of certainty in real-world investigation. They demonstrate how geography, time, evidence, and human perception intersect, in ways that can produce compelling patterns without guaranteeing unified explanations. And they remind us that in some systems, clarity is not a destination but a limit that shapes how far understanding can realistically extend. What remains, then, is a structured uncertainty, stable enough to be studied, complex enough to resist simplification, and persistent enough to remain in collective memory long after the active phases of investigation have ended. There comes a point in every long and unresolved series of investigations where the case stops being defined by new discoveries and starts being defined by how it is remembered. For the Edmonton cases grouped under the Killing Fields narrative, that point has already arrived. The active investigative layers have stabilized, the major forensic reviews have been completed within the limits of existing technology, and what remains is a form of institutional memory that continues to evolve even in the absence of new physical evidence. At this stage, the focus shifts from what can still be proven to what can still be understood. Analysts no longer expect a single unifying revelation to emerge. Instead, they examine how fragmented cases collectively shaped investigative practice, public perception, and regional awareness of vulnerability patterns in transitional urban environments. The Edmonton cases, in this sense, are no longer just a set of individual incidents. They have become a reference point in how complexity is handled when certainty is permanently out of reach. One of the most striking aspects of this late-stage reflection is how the geography continues to play a central conceptual role even after the investigations themselves have concluded. The outskirts of Edmonton, the industrial corridors, the undeveloped land beyond residential expansion, all remain present not as active crime scenes, but as analytical spaces. They are studied not because they contain ongoing activity, but because they represent conditions under which visibility breaks down and investigative clarity becomes harder to achieve. Over time, researchers examining these cases have increasingly emphasized the distinction between environmental opportunity and behavioral causation. The fact that multiple incidents occurred in similar types of locations does not, in itself, establish a shared origin. Instead, it highlights how certain environments can repeatedly appear in unrelated events simply because they share structural characteristics that reduce observation and delay discovery. This distinction has become one of the key lessons extracted from the Edmonton cases in modern criminological study. Another important development in retrospective analysis is the recognition of how strongly narrative frameworks can influence interpretation. When multiple unresolved cases are grouped under a single descriptive label, even informally, that label begins to shape how new information is perceived. Similarities become more visible, differences become less emphasized, and the mind naturally organizes fragmented data into a coherent storyline. In the Edmonton context, the Killing Fields narrative became a powerful organizing concept, even though official investigations never confirmed a single unified cause behind all incidents. This does not mean the narrative is incorrect, but rather that it functions on a different level than forensic conclusion. It is a cognitive and cultural structure rather than a legal or evidentiary one. It helps people make sense of uncertainty, but it does not replace the need for case-by-case analysis. The tension between these two modes of understanding remains one of the defining characteristics of how these cases are discussed even today. From an investigative methodology perspective, the Edmonton cases have contributed significantly to discussions about cold case management and long-term data integration. One of the key insights drawn from their review is the importance of maintaining cross-case analytical systems that allow for pattern recognition without prematurely collapsing individual cases into unified theories. This balance between connection and separation is delicate, and the Edmonton experience demonstrates both the value and the risk of interpreting patterns too early or too broadly. There is also a growing recognition that time itself is an active factor in investigative outcomes. As years pass, evidence degrades, witnesses become harder to locate, and memory becomes less precise. These are not simply logistical challenges, they fundamentally reshape what can be known. In the Edmonton cases, time created both clarity and limitation. It allowed for broader patterns to become visible, but it also erased certain granular details that might have been critical in earlier stages. Despite these limitations, periodic reviews of the cases continue, not as active investigations, but as part of archival reassessment processes that seek to identify whether new technologies or analytical methods can extract additional information from existing materials. Sometimes this results in minor clarifications or reclassifications. More often, it reinforces the existing boundaries of what is known and what remains uncertain. For the communities most directly affected, the passage of time has not eliminated the impact of these events. Instead, it has transformed the way they are carried. The immediacy of fear or active searching has been replaced by long-term absence and reflection. Memorialization becomes quieter, more private, less connected to public narrative structures. The cases remain present, but in a different emotional register. In broader cultural terms, the Edmonton killing field's concept has taken on a symbolic dimension that extends beyond its original investigative context. It now represents a category of unresolved complexity in urban crime analysis, where multiple factors overlap without producing a single, definitive explanation. It is referenced not as a conclusion, but as an example of how difficult it can be to fully reconstruct events that occur in environments where evidence is inherently limited. Ultimately, what defines this final phase of understanding is acceptance of structural incompleteness. Not every question resolves into a final answer. Not every pattern converges into a single source. And not every investigation, regardless of effort or technology, reaches total clarity. The Edmonton cases stand as a reminder of these boundaries. And so, in the absence of new developments, what remains is a stabilized form of uncertainty. One that is documented, analyzed, revisited and remembered, but never fully closed in the absolute sense. A narrative that continues to exist not because it is unresolved in a procedural way, but because it reflects the limits of how far investigation, interpretation, and human understanding can go when confronted with fragmented truth. At this stage in the long arc of the Edmonton cases, what emerges is not a continuation of active discovery, but a deepening of perspective. The investigations themselves have largely completed their operational cycles, yet the meaning extracted from them continues to evolve as new analytical frameworks are applied to old data. In this sense, the cases no longer belong exclusively to law enforcement archives or court records. They also belong to the broader field of interpretation, where criminology, geography, psychology, and even sociology intersect in attempts to understand what cannot be fully resolved through evidence alone. One of the most persistent themes in this final layer of analysis is the relationship between environment and perception. The outskirts of Edmonton, which played such a central role in earlier investigative phases, are now often studied as examples of how physical space influences both criminal opportunity and investigative difficulty. These areas are not inherently defined by crime, but by conditions that can obscure visibility, delay discovery, and fragment the continuity of observation. Long stretches of road, transitional industrial zones, and undeveloped land create a spatial structure where events can occur outside the immediate reach of consistent monitoring. This does not imply causation, but it does shape the conditions under which interpretation becomes difficult. When multiple incidents occur within such environments over time, the human tendency is to search for coherence, to assume that spatial repetition reflects intentional design. However, as later reviews have emphasized, spatial repetition can also emerge from shared structural characteristics rather than shared origin. In Edmonton's case, both interpretations continue to coexist without definitive resolution. Another important aspect of this phase is the evolution of investigative humility. Early in the process, there was a natural expectation that continued effort would eventually produce convergence, that fragmented cases would ultimately align under a single explanatory framework. Over time, however, it became clear that some investigative landscapes resist convergence not because of insufficient effort, but because the available evidence simply does not support it. This recognition has become a key lesson in modern cold case methodology, where the absence of complete information is treated not as a temporary obstacle, but as a structural condition. Within this context, the Edmonton cases are frequently cited as an example of how multiple independent investigations can generate overlapping patterns without forming a unified system. Each case retains its own evidentiary structure, its own timeline, and its own limitations. Even when viewed collectively, they do not necessarily produce a single narrative that can be confirmed through forensic means. Instead, they form a network of partial overlaps, where similarities exist but do not fully consolidate into a singular explanation. This analytical complexity has also influenced how cold case databases are designed and interpreted. Modern systems now place greater emphasis on maintaining the independence of each case while allowing for flexible comparative analysis. This approach helps prevent premature narrative consolidation while still enabling researchers to identify meaningful correlations when they genuinely exist. The Edmonton cases contributed significantly to the development of this balanced methodology, even if unintentionally. From a psychological perspective, these cases also reveal how the human mind responds to incomplete information over extended periods. When confronted with repeated but unresolved patterns, there is a natural inclination to construct explanatory narratives that restore a sense of coherence. This is not a flaw but a cognitive adaptation. However, in investigative contexts, it must be carefully managed to avoid conflating perceived patterns with confirmed connections. The Edmonton narrative demonstrates how powerful this cognitive process can be when reinforced over time by geography, media framing, and public discourse. For those who lived closest to these events, whether as family members, investigators, or community observers, the passage of time has transformed the emotional texture of the cases. Immediate urgency has given way to long-term reflection. The intensity of uncertainty has softened, but it has not disappeared. Instead, it has settled into a more stable form of awareness, where absence is acknowledged as part of ongoing life rather than an active crisis demanding resolution. In institutional terms, the cases now function as reference material. They are revisited in training environments, analytical discussions, and methodological reviews. Not because they can still be solved in a traditional sense, but because they illustrate the limits of what investigative systems can achieve under certain conditions. These limits are not failures. They are boundaries that define the scope of practical knowledge in complex environments. One of the most significant outcomes of this long-term reflection is the understanding that not all investigative questions are designed to converge into singular answers. Some remain distributed across multiple plausible explanations, each supported by partial evidence, but none fully encompassing the totality of observed phenomena. The Edmonton cases occupy this category. They exist as structured uncertainty, stable in documentation but incomplete in interpretation. Even as technology continues to advance, there is no guarantee that all historical gaps will eventually be filled. Some forms of information are lost permanently due to environmental exposure, procedural limitations, or simply the absence of recording at the time of occurrence. While future methods may refine understanding, they cannot reconstruct what was never preserved. And so, the final analytical position of the Edmonton cases is not one of closure, but of bounded comprehension. Enough is known to establish structure, yet not enough is available to eliminate ambiguity entirely. This balance defines the enduring nature of the case set. It is neither open in the active investigative sense, nor closed in the absolute sense. It exists in a stabilized intermediate state. In this state, the Edmonton cases continue to serve as a reminder that complexity in real-world systems often resists simplification, that patterns can exist without unified causation, and that understanding is sometimes defined not by what is concluded, but by the clarity with which limits are recognized and accepted. At this point in the extended examination of the Edmonton cases, the focus shifts even further away from investigation in the traditional sense and moves into a more reflective domain, where the case is no longer treated as a series of active inquiries, but as a long-term structure of unresolved information. The earlier phases were defined by urgency, discovery, and the gradual accumulation of fragmented evidence. Now, what remains is the interpretation of that accumulated material after it has already been processed through multiple investigative, legal, and analytical layers. One of the most significant developments in this reflective stage is the recognition that the Edmonton cases function differently depending on the lens through which they are examined. From a strictly forensic perspective, each case remains bounded by its own evidentiary limits. From a geographic perspective, they appear loosely clustered around transitional zones on the city's outskirts. From a sociological perspective, they reflect broader patterns of vulnerability and environmental exposure. None of these perspectives fully cancels the others, and none alone is sufficient to produce a complete explanation. This multiplicity of interpretation is what gives the cases their enduring complexity. Over time, investigators and researchers have increasingly accepted that certain datasets do not converge into a single explanatory model, not because the analysis is incomplete, but because the underlying structure of the events does not support full unification. In such situations, the goal of analysis shifts from resolution to coherence within constraints. The question becomes not how to eliminate uncertainty, but how to define it accurately. In the Edmonton context, this shift has led to a more nuanced understanding of how environmental factors interact with investigative outcomes. The city's geography, particularly its expanding perimeter zones, continues to be studied not as a causal factor, but as a contextual one. These areas, where urban infrastructure transitions into industrial corridors and then into open land, create conditions in which observation is intermittent and documentation is uneven. Over long periods, this can result in investigative records that are inherently fragmented, even when each individual case is handled correctly at the time of occurrence. As researchers revisit the aggregated data, they often emphasize the importance of distinguishing between structural patterns and causal patterns. Structural patterns refer to repeated similarities in location, timing, or environmental context. Causal patterns require demonstrable links that connect those similarities to a shared origin. In the Edmonton cases, structural patterns are clearly present, but causal patterns remain unconfirmed at the level required for unified classification. This distinction is critical in preventing overinterpretation of spatial or temporal clustering. Another layer of analysis concerns the evolution of investigative interpretation over time. Early stages of the inquiry were necessarily reactive, focused on immediate evidence and direct leads. Later stages became more analytical, incorporating comparative review and cross-case evaluation. In the current phase, the emphasis has shifted again, this time toward meta-analysis, where the investigation itself becomes the subject of study. Researchers examine not only what was found, but how conclusions were formed, how assumptions were introduced, and how narrative frameworks influenced interpretation. This meta-analytical approach has revealed that the Edmonton cases were shaped as much by the limits of information as by the information itself. Incomplete data sets, delayed discoveries, and inconsistent reporting intervals all contributed to a fragmented evidentiary landscape. Within such a landscape, it is natural for patterns to emerge that appear meaningful but may not necessarily reflect underlying causal unity. Understanding this dynamic has become an important part of modern cold case methodology. At the same time, the human dimension of these cases remains central even in abstract analysis. Behind every data point is an individual life that intersected with broader investigative systems under conditions that were often incomplete or uncertain. While analytical frameworks are necessary for understanding structure, they cannot replace the lived reality of those involved. This tension between abstraction and individuality is one of the enduring challenges in long-term case studies of this nature. Over the years, the Edmonton cases have also influenced how investigative agencies approach the concept of case aggregation. There is now greater caution around grouping cases too early based solely on geographic or circumstantial similarity. While aggregation can be useful for identifying trends, it also carries the risk of obscuring important differences between cases. The Edmonton experience demonstrated that both fragmentation and aggregation must be managed carefully to avoid distorting the underlying reality of the data. From a methodological standpoint, one of the most important insights to emerge is the need for adaptive frameworks that can accommodate uncertainty without forcing premature resolution. In complex investigative environments, rigid models often fail to capture the full range of variability present in real-world cases. Flexible analytical systems, by contrast, allow for the coexistence of multiple interpretations without requiring immediate consolidation into a single narrative. This approach has proven particularly relevant in the ongoing study of cold cases, where time introduces additional layers of complexity. As evidence ages and investigative contexts shift, the ability to reinterpret existing data without losing its original integrity becomes increasingly important. The Edmonton cases serve as a long-term example of how such reinterpretation can evolve while maintaining structural consistency. Despite the passage of time, the cases continue to occupy a unique position in collective memory and professional discourse. They are neither fully active nor fully resolved. Instead, they persist as a reference point for the limits of investigative certainty in environments characterized by fragmentation, environmental variability, and incomplete evidentiary continuity. In the end, what defines this phase of understanding is not resolution but stabilization. The cases have reached a point where their core structure is unlikely to change significantly unless entirely new and substantial evidence emerges. Within that stable structure, interpretation remains open but bounded. It is this balance between stability and openness that continues to define the Edmonton cases as an enduring subject of study, reflection, and methodological caution. At this advanced stage of reflection on the Edmonton cases, what becomes most apparent is that the passage of time has not simplified the narrative but instead layered it with additional forms of interpretation. Each new analytical generation approaches the same material with different tools, different assumptions, and different expectations, yet the underlying structure of the cases remains resistant to final consolidation. What was once an active investigative challenge has now become a long-term epistemological question about how certainty is constructed when evidence is inherently incomplete. One of the most consistent findings across these retrospective analyses is the persistence of partial clarity. Certain elements of the cases are well established, the geographic regions involved, the general environmental conditions surrounding discoveries, and the documented timelines of individual incidents. These components form a stable foundation of factual knowledge. However, surrounding this foundation is a much larger perimeter of uncertainty where interpretation must operate without the support of definitive linkage between cases. This separation between stable fact and unresolved context is what defines the enduring complexity of the Edmonton narrative. It allows for structured understanding at the level of individual incidents while preventing the formation of a singular explanatory model that encompasses all events without contradiction. In many ways, this dual structure is not unique to Edmonton, but the scale and persistence of the cases have made it one of the most frequently cited examples in discussions of fragmented investigative systems. As analytical techniques have evolved, particularly in the areas of data integration and geospatial modeling, researchers have revisited the distribution of cases with greater precision. These modern tools allow for more detailed visualization of how incidents relate spatially and temporally. What these models consistently reveal is not convergence toward a single focal point, but rather a dispersed pattern of occurrences concentrated in transitional environments. These environments share structural characteristics that make them difficult to monitor continuously, but they do not inherently demonstrate unified causation. This distinction has become increasingly important in contemporary criminological discourse. The presence of clustering does not automatically imply coordination, just as dispersion does not automatically imply randomness. Instead, each pattern must be evaluated within the broader context of environmental conditions, population movement, and investigative coverage. In the Edmonton cases, this layered evaluation consistently reinforces the same conclusion: pattern presence without definitive causal integration. Another important aspect of this phase of analysis is the reconsideration of how investigative narratives are formed over time. Early interpretations are often shaped by urgency and the need to establish direction quickly. Later interpretations benefit from hindsight and comparative analysis. However, both stages are influenced by the human tendency to seek coherence in complex systems. This cognitive tendency can be both useful and limiting. It helps organize fragmented information into understandable structures, but it can also create the impression of unity where none can be conclusively demonstrated. In the Edmonton context, this has led to a growing awareness of narrative compression, where multiple independent events are gradually interpreted as part of a single overarching story. While this process can aid communication and public understanding, it may also obscure the boundaries that separate individual cases. Recognizing and preserving those boundaries has become an important methodological priority in modern case analysis. From an institutional perspective, the Edmonton cases have contributed to significant changes in how long-term investigations are managed. There is now greater emphasis on maintaining modular case structures that allow for independent evaluation while still enabling comparative analysis when appropriate. This approach reduces the risk of premature consolidation and supports more accurate long-term interpretation of complex datasets. At the same time, the emotional dimension of these cases continues to exist outside of analytical frameworks. For those connected to the events personally, whether through family ties or investigative involvement, The cases are not abstract structures but lived experiences that continue to carry meaning. This human dimension resists full integration into analytical models, not because it is incompatible with them, but because it operates on a different register of understanding. As time continues to pass, the Edmonton cases have increasingly taken on the role of reference material within academic and professional contexts. They are studied not for definitive answers, but for the methodological challenges they present. These include the difficulty of working with incomplete data, the risks of overinterpreting spatial clustering, and the limitations of retrospective reconstruction in environments affected by long temporal gaps. One of the most important lessons derived from this body of cases is that investigative clarity is not always synonymous with narrative closure. It is possible to achieve a high degree of understanding regarding individual components of a system without arriving at a single unifying explanation for the system as a whole. This recognition has reshaped how similar cases are approached in contemporary practice, encouraging more flexible and layered forms of analysis. In this sense, the Edmonton cases occupy a unique position within the broader landscape of cold case studies. They are not defined by a single breakthrough, nor by a single unresolved mystery, but by the sustained coexistence of both clarity and uncertainty. This coexistence is not temporary, it has stabilized over time into a permanent feature of how the cases are understood. Ultimately, what remains at this stage is not a lack of information, but a recognition of structural limits. The available evidence defines what can be known with confidence, while the gaps in that evidence define the boundaries of interpretation. Within those boundaries, multiple perspectives remain valid, but none are sufficient to fully encompass the entirety of the phenomenon. And so the Edmonton cases persist not as an unfinished story awaiting completion, but as a fully documented yet inherently bounded system of events whose meaning continues to be explored within the limits of what evidence, time, and interpretation can collectively support. At this stage of long-term reflection on the Edmonton cases, the narrative no longer moves forward in a chronological sense. Instead, it circulates through layers of interpretation that have accumulated over time, each layer adding perspective rather than resolution. What began as a series of fragmented investigations has now become a stabilized analytical structure, where meaning is continuously examined but no longer fundamentally altered by new developments. The cases exist in a state where facts are largely established, but their broader interpretation remains open to discussion. One of the most significant characteristics of this final interpretive phase is the way certainty and uncertainty coexist without resolving into one another. Certain elements of the cases are firmly grounded in documentation, confirmed discoveries, verified timelines, and established geographic contexts. These elements form a factual core that remains unchanged regardless of perspective. Surrounding this core, however, is a much larger field of interpretive space, where hypotheses, patterns, and theories continue to circulate without achieving definitive convergence. This structure has led many researchers to describe the Edmonton cases as an example of bounded ambiguity. Within this framework, information is sufficient to prevent complete uncertainty, but insufficient to allow total explanation. It is a condition in which knowledge exists in layers of varying stability, where some conclusions are fixed while others remain perpetually provisional. This layered nature is what continues to make the cases relevant in academic and investigative discourse long after their active phase is ended. As analytical methods have improved over time, there has been a growing ability to separate confirmed data from interpretive overlay. Advanced mapping techniques, improved archival integration, and cross-reference databases now allow researchers to reconstruct the spatial and temporal distribution of incidents with greater accuracy than was previously possible. Yet even with these improvements, the fundamental structure of the cases remains unchanged. Better visualization does not necessarily produce new causation. It refines understanding without eliminating ambiguity. This distinction has become increasingly important in modern cold case methodology. There is a clearer recognition that increased data resolution does not automatically lead to increased explanatory power. In fact, in some cases, it can amplify the perception of pattern without providing additional causal evidence. The Edmonton cases exemplify this phenomenon, where improved clarity in presentation coexists with persistent uncertainty in interpretation. Another important aspect of this final phase is the reassessment of earlier assumptions. Over time, investigative frameworks evolve, and what was once considered a strong interpretive direction may later be reevaluated under new methodological standards. In the Edmonton cases, this has led to a more cautious approach toward pattern-based inference. While spatial clustering and demographic similarities remain observable, they are no longer treated as sufficient grounds for unified explanatory models without supporting forensic linkage. This methodological caution reflects a broader shift in how complex case systems are understood. There is now greater emphasis on preserving the independence of individual cases while still allowing for comparative analysis. This dual structure prevents premature consolidation while maintaining the ability to identify meaningful correlations when they are supported by evidence. It is a balance between analytical openness and evidentiary discipline. From a cultural perspective, the Edmonton cases have also undergone a transformation in how they are perceived. Initially framed through urgency and investigative incompleteness, they are now more often discussed as examples of systemic complexity within urban environments. The narrative has shifted from one of potential resolution to one of structural understanding. This does not diminish the seriousness of the events, but it changes the way they are contextualized within broader discussions of crime, geography, and investigation. For those who were directly affected, either through personal connection or professional involvement, this phase of reflection often carries a different emotional weight than earlier stages. The immediacy of uncertainty has faded, but it has been replaced by a more stable form of awareness. The absence that defined the early investigative period remains present, but it is now integrated into long-term memory rather than active crisis. This shift does not resolve emotional impact, but it changes its form. Within institutional memory, the cases continue to serve as reference points for the limits of investigative certainty. They are studied not because they can be fully explained, but because they demonstrate the boundaries of what can be achieved when evidence is partial, environments are complex, and time introduces additional layers of distortion. In this sense, the Edmonton cases function as a methodological mirror, reflecting both the strengths and limitations of investigative systems. As time continues, the likelihood of fundamental reinterpretation decreases, not because the cases are closed in an absolute sense, but because the remaining unknowns are embedded within structural gaps that are unlikely to be filled without entirely new forms of evidence. What remains is a stable equilibrium between what is known and what is permanently inaccessible within the current evidentiary framework. Ultimately, the Edmonton cases illustrate a central principle that extends beyond any single investigation. That understanding is not always equivalent to resolution. It is possible to achieve a high degree of analytical clarity while still acknowledging the presence of irreducible uncertainty. This coexistence is not a failure of investigation, but a reflection of the complexity inherent in real-world systems. And so, in their final interpretive form, the Edmonton cases persist not as an unfinished problem awaiting solution, but as a complete yet inherently bounded record of events whose full meaning exists partly within evidence, partly within interpretation, and partly beyond the reach of either. At this final stage of reflection on the Edmonton cases, what becomes most evident is that the structure of understanding itself has settled into a kind of equilibrium. The investigations no longer evolve in response to new evidence, but instead continue through reinterpretation of what is already known. Each review, each academic reference, and each methodological reassessment does not alter the core dataset, but rather adjusts the way that dataset is framed. In this sense, the cases have transitioned fully from active inquiry into a permanent analytical reference point. Within this stabilized state, one of the most important realizations is that the Edmonton cases do not form a single unified narrative in any strict evidentiary sense. Instead, they exist as a constellation of incidents that share certain environmental and contextual similarities while remaining individually distinct in their forensic foundations. This duality has remained consistent across all phases of review, from initial investigation through later comparative analysis and into the current reflective stage. It is precisely this duality that prevents complete closure while still allowing structured understanding. As analytical systems have become more sophisticated, there has been an increasing ability to separate layers of information that were previously blended together in early interpretations. Modern data models can distinguish between confirmed forensic facts, procedural records, environmental context, and interpretive hypotheses with greater clarity than before. This separation has not changed the underlying reality of the cases, but it has made visible the different levels at which meaning is constructed. What once appeared as a single unresolved question now appears as multiple interlocking questions operating at different scales. At the forensic level, the cases remain defined by specific constraints: limited physical evidence in some instances, degraded or incomplete material in others, and varying degrees of evidentiary strength across individual files. At the geographic level, patterns of distribution remain observable, particularly in relation to transitional zones between urban infrastructure and less developed land. At the temporal level, inconsistencies in discovery timelines continue to reflect the influence of environmental conditions and reporting delays. Each of these layers contributes to understanding, but none of them alone is sufficient to produce a comprehensive explanation. This layered structure has led to an important methodological shift in how such cases are approached in contemporary analysis. Rather than attempting to force convergence across all dimensions, there is now greater emphasis on maintaining analytical separation while still allowing for controlled comparison. This approach acknowledges that complexity is not always reducible without loss of meaning. In the Edmonton cases, this has proven particularly important, as attempts at full unification have consistently encountered evidentiary limitations. Another key aspect of this final interpretive phase is the recognition that time does not merely pass over investigations, but actively reshapes their context. Evidence that once existed in a specific procedural environment is later reinterpreted through new technological and conceptual frameworks. Witness accounts, forensic materials, and geographic data all undergo shifts in meaning as analytical tools evolve. However, these shifts do not necessarily lead to new conclusions. They often refine the boundaries of what can reasonably be inferred without altering the core structure of the cases themselves. From a broader criminological perspective, the Edmonton cases continue to function as an important example of how environmental complexity interacts with investigative limitation. They demonstrate that certain geographic and social conditions can produce investigative landscapes where clarity is partial by nature rather than by temporary circumstance. In such landscapes, even well-executed investigations may result in stable uncertainty rather than definitive resolution. This recognition has influenced how similar cases are now evaluated in other jurisdictions. There is greater awareness of the need to avoid overaggregation of cases based solely on spatial or demographic similarities. While such similarities can be useful for identifying potential leads, they are not sufficient on their own to establish unified causation. The Edmonton experience has reinforced the importance of maintaining a careful balance between pattern recognition and evidentiary rigor. At the same time, the human dimension of these cases remains unchanged in its significance. Behind every data point is an individual trajectory that intersected with broader systems in ways that were often unpredictable and irreversible. While analytical frameworks can describe structure and distribution, they cannot fully capture the lived reality of those involved. This gap between structural understanding and human experience remains one of the most enduring features of long-term investigative work. As the cases move further into historical rather than active status, their function within professional discourse becomes increasingly didactic. They are used to illustrate not only what can be achieved through investigation, but also what remains beyond its reach under certain conditions. This dual function gives them continued relevance, not as unresolved problems awaiting solution, but as stable examples of investigative boundaries. In this final state of reflection, what emerges is a clear but limited form of understanding. Clear, in the sense that the available evidence has been thoroughly examined, organized, and reevaluated across multiple frameworks. Limited, in the sense that no amount of reinterpretation can fully overcome the structural gaps inherent in the original data. These two conditions coexist without contradiction, forming the stable foundation upon which all current interpretations rest. Ultimately, the Edmonton cases no longer exist as an active question demanding an answer. They exist as a complete but inherently bounded system of knowledge, where meaning is constructed within the limits of what has been preserved, and where uncertainty is not a temporary obstacle, but a permanent feature of the record itself.